As we learned, abstract expressionism evolved in the 1940s and 50s. Then we learned about the art of popular culture and pop art of the 1960s. During this time in the 1960s, many artists were still working in abstraction. Now, it's important to note that even though the lecture is called 1960s Abstraction, many works in this movement were created starting in the mid-1950s and continued into the 1970s. Since the 1940s, art critic Clement Greenberg defined abstract expressionism as rejecting illusionistic space, flatness of the picture plane, allowing the paint to be seen as paint or the material to be themselves, that the work should be original and authentic. The main difference between the two movements is the post-painterly abstractionist favored openness or clarity in contrast to the dense painterly surfaces created by some of the abstract expressionists. With this new generation of post-painterly abstractionists, which was a term coined by Greenberg, there was an openness to design, and much of the work itself existed beyond the canvas, expanding on Jackson Pollock's drip paintings. They saw the closed composition being too contained and bound. Many artists began techniques of staining raw canvas. This way, they could still have the clarity and flatness of the many abstract expressionists, but it would also give their work a new and personal identity. The color staining of raw canvas achieves the merging of background and foreground. Sam Francis was an abstract expressionist and shows up again during post-painterly abstraction. This piece is titled Shining Back from 1958. Even though we can see this piece as being very painterly, it has an openness of design. So if we look down here, we can see the openness with the white, and it's here and then it's there, and then it comes in again at the side, and then the painted imagery or the abstract mark making here with the colors goes right off of the canvas and again up here. So the imagery transcends beyond the canvas. This next piece is a later piece by Sam Francis titled Number 11 from 1973. His later works, such as this, show clearly defined edges that create a much cleaner appearance. The patterns of stains and spatters is much more elegant than before and almost shows a lyrical quality to this piece. Helen Frankenthaler's work shows the transition between abstract expressionism and color field painting. Keeping in mind their engagement with modernism, the color field painters' relationship to abstract expressionism is one of continuity. They were not rebelling against each other. There was a continual evolution. Helen Frankenthaler's works are great examples of the staining on raw canvas and how the staining method fuses the background and the foreground. By fusing the two together, foreground and background no longer exist. Everything exists on the same space. This piece here by Helen Frankenthaler, called Mountains and Sea from 1952, is over 7 feet high and over 9 feet in length. This is a large canvas. She stained the raw canvas by pouring thin oil paint on top of it and allowing it to soak in. Because of the way it's created, the process is not hidden. She draws, and I'll show you here, she draws with charcoal. You can see some of the mark making as we go around. And what that does, it helps, as she pours her paint, it helps to guide her composition. This next painting by Frankenthaler is an acrylic on canvas. It's during this time in the 1960s where more artists are using acrylic paint. There are many that still use oil, but acrylic is now starting to make its presence known. Again, she uses a large canvas. This is over 8 by 7 feet. Here she creates her free abstraction in the middle and just below the middle. Then she builds up around it in layers of thin washes. This light and dark colors of purple and yellow nicely frame the center shape. The frames help make the center feel like it is opening up in its own space. This artist Morris Louis was inspired by Helen Frankenthaler. This painting is titled Calf. It's an acrylic on canvas and is over 8 by 12 feet. I want to stress that we are looking at these artworks out of context. These works were meant to be seen in person. We are seeing them at a smaller size with the colors prone to being inaccurate. There is a presence to the paintings that can only be truly appreciated when standing in front of these large works in person. Arranged by Clement Greenberg, he and Morris Louis visited with Helen Frankenthaler at her studio, where they saw for the first time her Mountains and Sea painting, the one we just looked at, and were very taken and inspired by this work, to the point where Louis and Kenneth Nolan both immediately began to stain their canvases. Louis's paint was thinner, making the bleeding to be more widespread and transparent. There is a softer flow in this piece. Louis eliminated the appearance of any brushwork. Here we see areas of color embedded in translucent washes. The colors are deep and warm with the soft edges on 3 sides of the canvas. At the bottom, the colors continue to move beyond the canvas. So if we look, we can see how the colors just move right off the canvas. Again, making the canvas and the imagery seem larger than they are. This next painting is titled Nix's Mate from 1964 by artist Larry Poons. Larry Poons developed the form of systematic art. Systematic art is art that involves an organized, mechanical-seeming approach. His work creates somewhat of an optical illusion through his repetitive, highly organized method. Poons applied a series of dots in specific locations or specific intervals on a sheet of graph paper. Once he created the desired pattern, he would then transfer his work onto a canvas. In this painting, we see a series of ellipses or ovals that are strategically placed throughout the canvas. These small shapes are placed on a bright red surface that is highly saturated. This painting is over 5 by 9 feet. Poons liked to work large so that the painting would envelop the visual field of the viewer, meaning that when the viewer was standing in front of the painting would be the only thing the viewer would see. This way, the viewer would get the full effect of his optical creations. This is an example of hard edge painting. Hard edge painting was a term that was originally used in 1956 by Jules Langsner, who was a critic living in California. Hard edge painting may look similar to geometric abstraction, but it's different. The way in which hard edge painting is distinct from other forms of geometric art is that there is no discernible figure-ground relationship. Hard edge painters looked for total unity in their work. There were several artists working in this style. One was Ellsworth Kelly. In this painting, titled Orange and Green, we see 2 fields of equally vibrant color. The curved orange shapes takes any jarring response away from the imagery. Okay, right there and then down here. Kelly combined curved and angular shapes. He was interested in the effect of combining stable, straight-edge forms with curved forms. Kenneth Nolan was close friends with Morris Louis, and like Louis, he used thin pigment to stain the canvas, as we can see here in this painting, a warm sound in a gray field. Between the mid-1950s to 1962, the circle or series of circles that were placed exactly in the center of his squared canvases were his main theme. Nolan eventually started doing paintings that had more linear, distinct, harder edges. He maintained his interest in the relationship between form and color, and he would eventually not only manipulate the painted surface, but also the shapes of its canvases. One of the most influential artists to create op art was Victor Vasarely. He was committed to op art, which is short for optical art and its theories of perception. Fusarli viewed the work of art as an idea that could be realized in a variety of media. He believed that art needed to have a social context and that art should be more than just paint on canvas. Fusarli chose to use geometric abstractions that were mathematically organized using flat standard colors. Op art is successful when the viewer looks at the works and the impression is given of movement, flashing and vibration, hidden images, patterns, or giving the impression of swelling or warping. This large glass construction, titled Serrata T, is a standing triptych. The 3 glass panels can be placed at different angles to create different patterns that provide different effects. This painting, called Vega Per, creates an illusion of a sphere protruding out from the center of the canvas. This optical illusion is created through the uniformly placed circles and squares created in different sizes and colors throughout the canvas. It's a good example of color theory. If you look in the center of the canvas right here, you will see large red circles surrounded by green. And in the corners, here, there, and of course the other corner here, you will see small green dots surrounded by red. Red and green are complementary colors, and when placed next to each other will vibrate. Red is brighter and will grab your attention before green will, which is why the red is larger in the center of the canvas, thus helping to create the illusion of a sphere protruding out from the center of the canvas. Another opt artist is Bridget Riley. Here in this painting titled Drift Number 2, Riley creates an optical illusion using black marks with variations of gray tones. This painting looks as though the surface of the canvas is weaving and swirling. Riley's paintings were often compared to and even provided the basis for textile designs. The desire by some artists not to disguise the nature of their medium can be traced back to Clement Greenberg. We can see that here in this piece by Alexander Calder that is titled Le Grand Vitesse. This is a large sculpture clearly made of sheet metal, bolts, and paint. Calder is not trying to hide or disguise any of his materials. This piece is reminiscent of Moreau's biomorphic imagery. We just learned how op art made the illusion of movement. Kinetic art is art that actually moves. This piece by Jesus Rafael Soto, titled Tríptico Negro y Blanco, is a construction piece. This is a visually sensitive and beautiful piece of work. However, when we examine it more closely, we see several metal rods sticking out of the canvas in different angles. So if we look, we can kind of see that going down here, on the other edge, and then in the center there and there. And the rods were delicately placed so the slightest breeze would cause them to move. Minimalist art shows an extreme visual reduction in its work. Minimal artists thought carefully about the environments their work would be placed in. They considered the psychological perceptions and importance of audience interaction. Of course, this type of audience interaction would be much more contemplative than, say, a happening. Minimalists wanted their art to be thought-provoking and considered full participation for the viewer. They wanted the viewer to walk up to and around the art. A term that would describe the experience of a minimalist sculpture would be embodied. This piece by Anthony Caro is called Riviera. It is made of rusted steel. These large strips of steel appear to be weightlessly arranged. They do not appear to be as heavy and bulky as they really are, and he wanted them to have an organic feel. There is a linear beauty to this piece. Caro here displays compositional unity and is harmoniously balanced. This is one of the paintings that gave Frank Stella recognition early in his career when he exhibited this in 1960 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. This is one of his black paintings titled Raise the Flag. This is a larger vertical rectangle with a symmetrical pattern of light lines. At first, it looks as though Stella drew these lines on top of the canvas. However, these white lines that you see here, all these white lines that you see, and it goes across, were actually the canvas, and the black was painted around these lines. This is a tedious and time-consuming process. This painting is symmetrically balanced with its repetitive line work. This painting is titled Agbetona 3 from 1968. These are semicircles that look like they were drawn using a protractor tool and are referred to as his protractor works. Here we see that he is now using bright fluorescent colors. This is a large piece that is over 9 by 14 feet. Tony Smith was a sculptor whose most important works were created during the 1960s. This is a minimalist sculpture. He was respected by other minimalists of his time for his viewpoints about art. Smith believed that the viewer should experience art, not just stand in front of it. He also liked the idea of creating a world without tradition. His minimalist sculptures were large abstract pieces like this one, titled Cigarette from 1961 to 1966. Smith was inspired by a cigarette that was not fully smoked, then put out in an ashtray. The sculpture started out as plywood model, then was eventually remade of Corten steel. Over time, this steel begins as an orange color and changes to a warm brown. The patina or surface can rust when exposed to changing weather, and over time the work surface deteriorated. In the spring of 2008, the Albright Knox Art Gallery Museum, after receiving a significant grant, was able to conserve and return the surface of Cigarette to its original state. After the conservation, the surface of the work once again began to change from a bright orange to a brown patina. This piece by Smith is titled Die, and it is a perfect cube measuring 6 by 6 by 6 feet. I don't believe the measurements in the title are to be read into together, nor does it represent the die that can be thrown around and gambled with. Here, Smith again uses steel that will change and patina or rust, giving this piece the power to transform itself over time. Another minimalist sculptor and theorist was Donald Judd. In 1965, he wrote an essay called Specific Objects, where he defined the convictions of minimalists and their questioning of traditional classifications of painting and sculpture. He was quoted as saying, "A work can be as powerful as it can be thought to be. Actual space is intrinsically more powerful and specific than paint on a surface. A work need only be interesting." In some ways, Judd is saying that a piece of art is not just what it stands for, but how you interpret it. It was a new attitude toward art making. His work was one of extreme precision. In this untitled piece, Judd creates 7 boxes, all identical units of galvanized iron. Judd strived for, in his minimal sculpture, absolute unity or wholeness through repetition of identical units in perfect symmetry. By 1977, we can see how Judd's work had grown in scale. This untitled piece measures 49 feet in its outer ring, 44 feet in the inner ring, and measures almost 3 feet to 6 feet in height. With this cement piece, Judd wanted it to appear with the environment as it composed movement and order for the visitor to experience. This is an installation view of Sol LeWitt's Sculpture Series A from 1967. The installation shows open cubes of different sizes that are placed in a grid. The only physical quality of this sculpture is the outline of the cubes. However, the cubes are empty spaces. LeWitt believed that the idea behind the work of art was more important than the art itself. LeWitt liked geometric abstraction. This work is titled Wall Drawing Number 652. In this piece, we see his continued use of geometric shapes, but they are now painted on walls instead of three-dimensional forms in a space. This is a much later piece dated from 1990. This piece, as colorful as it is, shows no personal touch. LeWitt's wall drawings are emblematic or representative of the minimalist precept, meaning guidelines, that of the elimination of the artist's hand. Robert Ryman was concerned with the relationship between pigment and support. He was fascinated by paint and its qualities. By the mid-60s, Ryman started using only white in his works. This piece is polymer on paper and is titled Classico 3. All we can see here is white paint applied to handmade paper. The same rectangular shape and the shadows in between the papers right here. So if we look right here, we can see the shadows where the papers meet. And what they do is they serve as a grid or break in the work. The white on white has soft, understated, rustic beauty to it. Ryman's all-white paintings have allowed him to focus his attention on his materials. He did not have to worry about what color to put where. As with other minimalists, Ryman did take into consideration how the visitor would react with this piece and with all of his pieces. Ryman was concerned with how high on the wall it would hang and how far the visitor would be in relationship to his works. He was also concerned with how his works would be viewed and experienced from different distances and locations. Agnes Martin was influenced by the artworks of Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, and Paul Klee. This is Night Sea by Agnes Martin from 1963. Martin's works of art are meditative and restful, which have a sense of timelessness. Here is a light and sensitive painting by Agnes Martin, which is Untitled No. 5 from 1975. Again, we see her work of art as meditative and restful. Richard Sierra was a sculptor who worked in large, heavy sheets of steel or lead that balanced on top or against one another. He was another minimalist who let the material be the material. He did not hide the fact that his sculptures were made of metal and in fact embraced its unique beauty. Sierra, like other minimalists, wanted the visitors to explore and interact with art, and these last images are great examples of that.